Chapter 1 Exiled from London. Dear Will, do you remember me? I am Frank Osbaldistone, and I want to narrate the adventurous story of my early life. It was the year 1714 and I was about 20. My father ordered me to come back from Bordeaux, France, where I worked, and to return to London. My father was the founder of the business house Osbaldistone and Tresham, with offices in Crane Alley, London. He was a tall man, full of energy, with dark, penetrating eyes. He had a fiery spirit, full of initiative and acute powers of analysis. He never used a word in vain, and he never got really angry, but when he was displeased, he spoke in a brusque manner. My father wanted me to become his successor in the family business, but I preferred to study literature and write poems. He tried everything to convince me to change my mind and eventually threatened, "I have a brother in Northumberland and he too has children, Frank. I will ask one of your cousins to take your place in the business, if you do not obey me." Showing little respect for his wishes, I replied, "You can do as you please, the business is yours. I will never sell my liberty for gold." As I was very obstinate. In the end my father decided to send me to his brother at Osbaldistone Hall in the north of England. The following morning I took the road to York. Mounted on a good horse and with 60 guineas in my pocket. I was sad, but I did not want to go back to London. I wanted to show my father that I was adult enough to decide for myself and that I was truly convinced of my decision. The journey was monotonous, but sometimes I had the opportunity to speak to different travellers, parsons, farmers, officers. We spoke of many different matters: taxes, markets, wars and outlaws. One man that I met, Mr. Morris, was particularly afraid of outlaws. He had a heavy portmanteau which he never abandoned for a moment. He never mentioned his destination, he trusted nobody, and he was afraid of me, too. In those days travellers used to break their journey on Sundays. They rested their horses and had dinner together at the local inn, where the innkeeper offered them a meal. On this particular Sunday I stopped at Darlington, at the Black there, with my new companion, the strange Mr. Morris. A Scotsman, Mr. Campbell, joined us for dinner. It was the first time I had met a Scotsman, and I looked at him with curiosity because I had many prejudices against the inhabitants of Scotland. When I was a child my nurse told me terrible stories about them, of blood and revenge. I considered the Scottish people dishonest, avaricious and hostile to Englishmen. Mr. Campbell was a tall, athletic man who spoke to other people with superiority. Strangely, my timorous companion Mr. Morris asked if he could travel north with him, but Mr. Campbell refused. "Your companion talks too much," he said. "It is unsafe to say where you are going in these troubled times." Chapter 2. The Osbaldistones. The following morning, I left the company to go westward where my uncle lived in Osbaldistone Hall. The landscape was romantic and picturesque and appealed to my love of nature. I went past rivers and little solitary valleys until I arrived at Osbaldistone Hall. The house was in a glen between two mountains, surrounded by a large wood of oaks. I was on a hill above Osbaldistone Hall when I heard the sound of dogs and horses. It was a fox hunt. I saw some men, dressed in green and red uniforms, riding after the fox, and I thought, "Here are my cousins." Suddenly I had a vision. A beautiful young lady appeared in front of me. Her face was uncommonly fine and animated by the hunt. She had long, black hair down to her shoulders. She was wearing riding clothes, like a man, and rode a splendid black horse. Just then the sound of a horn announced the end of the chase. A young man came triumphantly towards us. He was carrying the fox's tail in his hand. The young woman spoke to him, then she turned to me and said, "Excuse me, did you meet a young man on the road, Mr. Osbaldistone?" "I am Francis Osbaldistone," I answered. "Ah? I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Osbaldistone. This young man is Thorncliffe Osbaldistone, your cousin, and I am Diana Vernon," she continued. Diana accompanied me to Osbaldistone Hall, where my uncle, Sir Hildebrand Osbaldistone, welcomed me. He was a man of about 60, dressed in hunting clothes. Once he had been a soldier and a knight under King James II. After the king's deposition, he retired to his lands in the countryside where he was lord. "These are your cousins, Francis," he told me. "Percy, Thorneye, John, Dick, Wilfred and Rashleigh. The girl you met earlier is Di Vernon, Diana, my dead wife's niece. She lives here too. Now, shall we have dinner together?" My cousins were all tall, well-built and good-humored, with the exception of Rashleigh. He was different from the others, short, thin, lame, and his expression was cruel. However, these disadvantages were partly compensated for by his very soft, sweet voice and his great ability in putting words together. Diana Vernon was sitting next to me at dinner and gave me some information about my cousins. Rashleigh, she said, wanted to become a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, but his deformity prevented him from entering the seminary. She also revealed that my father had chosen Rashleigh to take my place in his company. After dinner my cousins started to drink and laugh immoderately. As my foreign education had given me a dislike for intemperance, I preferred to be alone and decided to go for a walk in the garden. On one of the little paths I met a gardener. He touched his Scottish bonnet with an air of respect. "Good evening, my lord," he said. "I am Andrew Fairservice. For 24 years I have served the Osbaldistones." He was very talkative. He told me that he was a Presbyterian, and when he heard that I was an English dissenter, he took out a tobacco box and offered me a little. I asked him about Di Vernon. "Oh, the young mistress? The lassie Vernon," he answered. "She is a Catholic and, what is worse, she is a Jacobite." Chapter 3 Accused of robbery. I went to bed that night, thinking about the strange Osbaldistone family, my father, Rashleigh, and Di Vernon. When I woke up, I heard the horn announcing that the fox hunt was beginning again. In the courtyard, where men, dogs, and horses were in full preparation, I met Di Vernon. We left with the rest of the hunting party, but after a few miles we were alone. They guided me to the top of a hill, and stopped her horse under some trees. She indicated some mountains on the far horizon. She said that they were in Scotland and that if necessary my horse could take me there in 2 hours. I was surprised. I had no desire to go to Scotland. What should I do in Scotland? I asked. Provide for your safety, she replied. Didn't you travel here with a man, Mr. Morris? The girl asked me then. Well, yes. I traveled with a strange little man who was always worried about his portmanteau, I answered, slowly. Someone stole that bag, Frank, explained Di. "You do not think I am a thief?" I replied, angrily. "Mr. Morris is an agent for the London government," she continued. "He was carrying important documents and money for the English soldiers in the north. You are accused of robbery and of treason, Frank Osbaldistone." "So, I am a traitor, too?" I exclaimed angrily. She saw I was angry and tried to console me. "Around here many important people are in favor of James II and against the Hanoverians," she said. "Your crime is considered the crime of a gentleman, and a king's man. But I want to refute this terrible accusation." "Who is examining my case?" I demanded. "Judge Inglewood. He told my uncle to show you the road to Scotland," replied Di. "Then I must see him and tell him the truth." Diana insisted on accompanying me. When we arrived, we were surprised to meet Rashleigh coming out of Judge Inglewood's house. The judge was having lunch when we entered. Another man was with him at the table. It was Mr. Morris, my timorous travelling companion. He said that one of the robbers had mentioned the name of Osbaldistone. "But that is not a good reason to accuse me," I replied. At that moment, the servant announced the arrival of another gentleman, and I was surprised to see Mr. Campbell, the other man I had met on my journey north. He explained to Judge Inglewood that he had been with Mr. Morris when the bandits attacked him. "Why didn't you help Mr. Morris, then?" asked the judge. "Mr. Morris is strong enough to defend himself," he replied coldly. "I am a man of peace. I do not want to have trouble with the law. But of one thing I am sure, Mr. Osbaldistone was not one of the bandits who stole the bag." At that point, Mr. Morris retracted his accusations against me and the judge declared I was innocent. Soon after, Mr. Morris left the house with Campbell. Di Vernon and I rode back to Osbaldistone Hall. The girl started to tell me something of her life. She had many troubles, she said. I tried to learn more, but she replied mysteriously, "I cannot reveal my secrets." At Osbaldistone Hall, Di ordered dinner for us in the library. The ancient, dark library was full of books, very untidy and neglected. On one wall was a portrait of Di's grandfather, Lord Vernon, with a Vernon motto above it. He had been loyal to the kings of the Stuart dynasty, she said, and had shared the misfortunes of Charles I. The Vernon family, once important, was now ruined. During our meal, Rashleigh entered. "I must thank you for calling Mr. Campbell. His defense saved me," I said. I was curious and wanted to learn more about the connection between Rashleigh and Campbell, so we continued to talk until Diana went to bed. Chapter 5. New Troubles. The following day was Sunday, a dull day at Osbaldistone Hall. We all attended the formal religious service in the morning and, when it was over, Sir Hildebrand congratulated me. "Ha ha! So you did not go to prison after all, my lad. You were lucky this time, but do not tempt fate again." His words embarrassed and irritated me. "On my honor, sir," I replied. "I am innocent. I was not involved in that detestable crime." I was saved from more embarrassment by the arrival of Rashleigh. He was leaving soon for London and wanted to know more about my father, his relations with me and about the business. I, however, was more curious to find out about Di Vernon. We were close friends once and I was her tutor, he said. Then my studies took me far from her. She must now decide between life in a convent or a convenient marriage. She is engaged to Thorncliffe, my brother. But I am convinced that I am better qualified for her. These words hurt me, and that evening, when I met Di, I was cold and rude to her. At dinner I drank too much, and so I talked too much, quarreled and laughed immoderately. Rapidly I lost all control. It seemed to me that Rashleigh was making insinuations about my feelings for Di, and, furious with him, I slapped his face. My cousins took me by force to my room and locked the door. I slept badly, and the next morning I knew I must apologize for my behavior. My cousins accepted my excuses, only Rashleigh showed his resentment. I also apologized to Diana for my discourtesy to her. She insisted on knowing what had provoked my bad humor, and, embarrassed, I told her. She answered that I had to be careful when speaking to Rashleigh. I decided then that I had to inform my father about my cousin's true character and wrote him a letter. It was after this that I realized how much Miss Vernon and the secrets around her occupied my thoughts. I was falling in love. Rashleigh left the hall for London, and after his departure I started to help Di with her studies. I discovered that while she had had an extremely good education, she was totally ignorant of real life beyond the hall and knew nothing of accepted feminine behavior. One day Andrew Fairservice, the gardener, informed me that news of the robbery incriminating me was circulating in London. I was anxious and decided to send another letter to my father to explain, and rode into town to post it. At the post office I found a letter from Owen, my father's clerk, waiting for me. He said that he was worried because he had had no recent news from me. He did not mention my previous message concerning Rashleigh, and so I became suspicious. Does someone intercept my letters at Osbaldistone Hall? I wondered. That evening, when I was in the garden, I saw a light at the library window. This was not unusual because Diana often read there alone. But I was surprised when I observed the shadows of two people inside. After that I became jealous and started to watch Miss Vernon's looks and actions. I was desperate to know who visited her in the library. The next time I saw the light there again, I ran into the library, but I found Diana alone. However, there was a man's glove on the table. Diana refused to give me any explanation. With an air of authority she told me I should spend my time in a better way, instead of spying on her. Then she gave me a letter which had arrived for me. Gracious heaven! I cried. My folly and disobedience have ruined my father. This letter says that Rashleigh has gone to Scotland. During my father's absence in Holland, Rashleigh left London taking documents and large sums of money from the company. Mr. Owen is now in Scotland too, in Glasgow, trying to discover where Rashleigh is hiding. I decided I had to go to Scotland immediately to help my father's clerk. Before I left, Diana gave me a sealed packet without an address, and ordered me to open it only in an emergency. Chapter 5. Reunion with a friend. I asked Andrew Fairservice to accompany me into Scotland because I did not know the country. We met at 3 in the morning because we didn't want to wake the Osbaldistone family. On a Saturday evening, after a long ride, we arrived in Glasgow, the principal town in the west of Scotland. The next morning all the bells of the city announced the sanctity of the day, Sunday. I wanted to start looking for Owen immediately, but Andrew said, "You cannot do anything until the church service is over." So I decided to go to the Cathedral of Glasgow, a solid and massive example of Gothic architecture. While all the people were silent and listening to the sermon, a voice from behind me whispered distinctly in my ear, "You are in danger in this city. Meet me tonight at the brig at 12 precisely." I turned round, but there was no one there. I spent the rest of the day at the inn reflecting on what I should do. In the end I decided to go to the appointment on the bridge. I waited on the bridge in the dark. I was very apprehensive. What was going to happen? Then the clock struck midnight, and suddenly a stranger appeared near me and said, "Mr. Osbaldistone, follow me." I hesitated and replied, "Can't you give me your information here? You must receive it from your eyes, not from my tongue," he said. "You must follow me, or remain in ignorance." So I obeyed and was surprised when the man led me to Glasgow prison. The prison guard, a Highlander called Dougal, seemed happy to see my companion. He took us upstairs to a cell where a prisoner was sitting dejected in the corner. It was Mr. Owen. He recognized me and exclaimed, "What? You are here too? Oh? Mr. Frank, your company is ruined and now you are in a Scottish prison. God help us." I assured him that I was not a prisoner and asked him to explain what had happened. What was he doing in Glasgow prison? He told me that my father had two correspondents for his business in Scotland, the House of MacVittie Macfin and Company and the Bailey, Mr. Nicol Jarvie. They transacted a great deal of business for the London firm and Owen had gone to see them when he arrived in the city. "I immediately contacted MacVittie and Macfin," said Owen. They had always professed themselves obliged and devoted to Mr. Osbaldistone. So I openly revealed the present difficulties of the house caused by the absence of your father and the disappearance of Rashleigh. I asked for counsel and financial assistance regarding the next payments, but when they discovered they had large credits with Osbaldistone and Traceham, they refused to help me. They had me arrested and sent to prison as a debtor instead. Just then we were interrupted by a loud knocking on the prison door. A few minutes later, Bailey Jarvie himself came in and spoke to Owen, asking to see his papers. He examined them with great attention, then said, "You owe money to several people in Glasgow. But you cannot pay your debts if you are in prison. I will act as your guarantor and they will let you go free." Bailey Jarvie took the lamp and scrutinized the other people in the room. "Ah. Eh? Oh? My conscience. It's impossible and yet, no. You robber. You devil that you are. Can this be you, Robin?" exclaimed the Bailey. "That is so," was my guide's laconic answer. Mr. Jarvie also wanted to know who I was and then asked me, "Young man, how will you find the £5,000 to pay your father's bills in 3 days?" I didn't know what to say, then suddenly I remembered Diana's packet. I opened the seal and a letter dropped onto the floor at Mr. Jarvie's feet. After examining the name on the envelope, he gave it to Robin. I realized then that my mysterious guide was in fact Mr. Campbell himself. I recognized his deep voice, his severe face, and his Scottish accent. Mr. Campbell read the letter, then instructed Owen to remain in Glasgow. He told me Bailey Jarvie and I should go to his Highland home in the Glens. The next day I went to the Bailey's home for lunch and found Owen there. The honest man was depressed after his stay in the prison, but Mr. Jarvie's kind and friendly interest in my father's affairs consoled him. I asked the Bailey to tell me something about Robert Campbell. He is a distant cousin of mine. Many people have been cruel to him. He is a Highland cattle merchant that wears the tartan when he is in the hills and trousers when he is in Glasgow, explained the magistrate. Then he started to examine some business documents with Owen. As I could not help them, Mr. Jarvie suggested going out for a walk. I could return later for lunch.